All right, looks like we've got everyone joining the call, which is great to see. Welcome everyone to Antler's fireside chat. We'll just wait a minute or two as people sign into the event. I can see people streaming in, which is great. Maybe as you join, feel free to let us know where you're tuning in from at the end of the day. This is a global chat. So for example, I'm speaking to you from Sydney today, where it's a balmy 27 degrees Celsius. It's a pretty beaut day and I'll probably get outside after this, but we've got someone joining us from Ballarat, Fran and James. Nice to have you here. And Hobart, awesome. It's great to have these global events where people kind of from everywhere around the globe. Looks like we've got a big Australian contingency here, or contingent here, and we've got someone from Texas as well, which is awesome. I think the time zones will see probably more of an APAC audience, but people will watch the recording from elsewhere. Cool, awesome. Let's kick things off. Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Kamali. I'm the VP of Operations for Antler here in Australia. And today we're lucky enough to have Kim Teo, CEO and co-founder of Mr. Yum, join us as a special guest. Today's event will explore what it means to transition from a first mover to category leader, delving into Mr. Yum's inception and evolution in a mobile payments company with over 13 million global users. So before we get started, you're all pretty all over it already, but we will just do some light housekeeping. If you do have any questions throughout the chat, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A function. If you do drop them into the chat, we'll do our best to get to them and we'll either integrate them into the conversation with Kim or take them at the end. And throughout today's discussion, if you want to join in on the chat or share it with others on social media, you can find Antler on LinkedIn, Twitter, and all other kind of major platforms. We'd love for you to share some of the insights that are going to be shared from Kim and also Bede today. And just in case you haven't heard of Antler, who we are and what we do, we are a global early stage VC that enables and invests in exceptional people and companies building the defining companies of tomorrow. We support them essentially as a long-term investor, providing a clear pathway to capital. We support them through our global footprint to scale and then also allow them to access the world's fastest growing network of early stage entrepreneurs. We will also drop some more information in the chat if you're looking for some additional insights from us or how to get in contact with us or potentially apply to build your company with us. You can find that there now. But for now, that's all from me. I'm going to hand over to Bede Moore, Managing Partner of Antler in the APAC region, and he will introduce and lead today's discussion with our special guest. So over to you, Bede.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everybody. So good to see so many of you here today. Thanks very much for joining us. I did notice actually in the chat earlier on, not many people from Sydney, and presumably because cleverly everybody's gone to the beach. And that's what I would be doing if I didn't have something better to do, which is talking to Kim today. I'm very delighted to have Kim Teo with us. She is the CEO and a co-founder of Mr. Yum, which recently closed a staggering amount of money for Series A. And actually, it's interesting, Kim, because I have been at a few events recently. Like I was complaining to a friend of mine the other day about not having invested in an Antler company, which has since done incredibly well. And he was like, "Yeah, that was a bummer, but you know what? I was in the Mr. Yum round," and I was like, "Okay, you got me, touche." That was that's very cool. So you are the talk of the town at the moment. Congrats. And you know, I hope that you are riding high on that. I want to give people a little bit of your background, and then we can jump into some questions. For everybody who's on the line, you know, please ideally put your questions in the ribbon at the bottom of your screen in the Q&A, because it's easier for me to sort through while I'm speaking. But you can also do the chat. And we will make time specifically for questions towards the end of the conversation. But feel free to ask us while we're going on. As I said, my guest today is Kim. She's had a diverse and interesting life living across Singapore, Australia, the US and UK. She's been a successful corporate leader, and as all great entrepreneurs do, she realized that was a road to nowhere, and she decided to go and build an amazing company. And so I think that was kind of maybe five or six or 7 years ago. And while she was on, her discovery of the entrepreneurial life back in 2015, she met her co-founders, Adrian and Kerry, and they evolved their thinking into a neighborhood meal platform called Neighbor Flavor, which I love that name, by the way. That is really clever and awesome. And that was where ultimately they helped to validate their ideas, working at a local accelerator before they set their sights on building a new business, which in 2018 was Mr. Yum. And, for those of you who don't know the two bookends, so that 2018 was when the business was started. And I guess the other and more bookend is that they recently closed an $89 million Series A round, which is insane, just really insane. And now I think are embarking on explosive growth. And so, Kim, I can't wait to hear about it. Welcome.
Thank you so much. That was a lovely intro.
My pleasure. It's easy to talk. It's easy to talk to. It makes it. I don't have to. Don't have to add anything. It speaks for itself. So I'm going to try and provide some context for people who don't know your business, just to give them a flavour. That is a pun, and just give them a flavour about the.
Noted.
I'm a dad. I don't know if you can tell that, like, from that one. Actually, to give them a bit of a flavour of what you're doing, and but jump in and tell us, right? So the business has been going for 3 years, and the concept originally was kind of bringing menus to life, in that a user would scan a QR code, and then the customer could easily see all the dishes on the menu via their phone. And that relatively quickly, then that turned into a kind of a mobile order and payments platform, right? And let's just stop there and say, so am I right in saying that in that original format, when you first started to go, like, how did you, because there's things like Me and You and a variety of these other ones out there, what did you think was going to be the defining component of the business at that point in time?
The origination of the idea was quite different to the menu, and I think others at the time. The category was so new, like super nascent. There'd been other products that had tried and unsuccessfully, because before 2018, QR codes were not easily accessible via a camera. So if you had an iPhone in 2017, you had to download an app, and then you had to, ironically, download the app to scan the QR code to use a web-based product, which is not exactly a frictionless approach to getting to a web-based product. So there were a few companies that built app-based products, but to get someone to download an app, you have to offer them things like, $5 in your first offer, etc. And it's a pretty tough way to gain traction. So when we started Mr. Yum, we actually had the idea for probably about 12 months leading up to actually starting, but we're waiting for the right time. And I think that's something that I learned in the 2 other failed or semi-successful startups that I did prior. Timing is everything. So we waited for 2 things. One, Apple Pay was starting to take off. So like one-touch payments became super easy. You didn't have to sit there and like enter your full credit card details into the payment solution. And then also seeing Apple put QR scanners into the app in June. So it happened in June 2018, and we launched in November 2018. And when we saw that, we were like, right, that's a gateway for us to be able to do what we want to do with a frictionless product. So yeah, from the first day, we've always wanted to like make it super easy, make the uptake, and make the product easily accessible. And I think others didn't quite take the same approach. And then, after a while, they pivoted and got there too.
Now I'm kind of torn here because I promised that I was going to provide some context about Mr. Young, but what I really want to ask you about is how you got into all this. And I suggest let's go with the latter. It's interesting that, you know, you say I had 2 semi-successful businesses and I was, you know, you were going on your 3rd. So let's go all the way back to when you're sitting in your corporate job. What was the moment that made you realize that was not the place that you wanted to be?
Yeah,
Was it
I grew up in a pretty like small business family, but both my parents had small businesses independently as I was growing up. And when I say small, like never to the tune of more than 40 people in their team. So like, you know, a traditional small business. The flexibility it gave us though, like my parents being able to be at the events that they wanted to be, etc., I held very close to me. And I knew that in working for a corporate that it may not afford me the same flexibilities in my life. So I think I always knew I wanted to do something of my own that I had a little bit more control over. And then the second piece was I was enjoying especially consulting, and I know that you did consulting for a period of time, and the environment in consulting is a very you get to work on pretty interesting projects, but also more importantly work around really, really smart and engaged people. And I think I really enjoyed that. And whilst I was doing my consulting role, I actually got to the point when I was about 25 where they were talking about promoting me into a manager role. And the manager role was known to be the worst role that you can do at that company, because it's kind of the role where you're like sandwiched between having to do like managing up and managing down, and it's just this really like sticky in the middle role. And of course it came with, you know, a decent amount of money and a good paycheck, etc. And I thought to myself, and I was like 3 months out, I think, from about to be getting promoted into that role. And I thought, if I stay and I take that role, I'm going to be here forever. Like I'm going to be like career consultant. I'm going to be stuck in this, they call it golden handcuffs, getting, you know, being 25 and getting paid too much for you to go and find an opportunity somewhere else, or to leave that opportunity behind. And so and during consulting, I was like starting lots of like random ideas when I was on the bench. So like, you know, when you weren't on project for 2 or 3 weeks, my consulting friends and I would like start like silly random ideas, and then we get put on a project and you just get too busy, and then you just like completely lose momentum, all the things that you wanted to do. And so I thought, okay, I'm not gonna, like, I didn't have an idea at the time that I, you know, really, really cared about. And so I went and found like a straight up 9-to-5 role. So like a role that I knew I could do in like less hours than 9-to-5. And I knew that I'd essentially have time to really start building something on the side. So I went and worked at BP, which is a terrible oil and gas company. And I did about 2 or 3 hours worth of work every day for like the period of maybe 12 months. Ticked all the boxes, did all the things that they wanted me to do, but I was actually like busy building my first company on the side with my sister, which was an e-com business. I'd like book meetings with myself, and I'd lock myself in like a room for 2 or 3 hours and just like be on Shopify, like building e-com platforms basically. And so I think the way that I transitioned out of corporate is an important one. I didn't kind of like throw in the towel and, you know, have all of your income pretty much decimated straight away, and then be like doing the typical like living with all your flatmates. And like I didn't want to do that because I didn't feel like I needed to. Instead, I, you know, found a really simple job that I knew I could crush in short amount of time, and then actually ended up doing 3 days worth of, I left that and I ended up doing a 3-day consulting gig that paid me really good money whilst I was building my startup. So it was actually genuinely like a 2 or 3 year transition out of work and into a self-sustaining role. And I only really left at the time that I found something that I was like, cool, this is it. I want to put everything into this project / idea / startup.
That's super. Like, look, that's really interesting. Obviously the only worrying thing about that is you'll probably never get a job at BP again after that public disclosure.
Oh, it's fine.
Yeah. That's, I think, like, what's interesting, and you know, we hear it pretty often, is this thing where it's like somebody has in their mind that they, you know, that they do just want to go and build a business, and it's almost like part of it is like fending off the things that the distractions, like, yeah, you know, oh, I'm 25, should I go and take $250,000? It's like, well, yeah, you can, but like, it's going to be it's going to be really hard for you to then go to earning pretty much $0 while you go and build your company, right? Unless you're smart about it. But what I also like is, and I have personally been terrible about this in life, is like, it sounds like you had genuinely like a kind of a 5-year plan, if you know what I mean, like, or at least the concept of a direction that you were going to head, and you kind of relentlessly pursued it, and you fit everything else around it. I typically say to people, hey, like, you're never going to get serious unless you're serious. And that means don't do anything else. Just throw yourself fully in. And you've taken a different pathway. Like, how was it then that you made the call to like ditch the part-time consulting work? What was it that gave you a sense of comfort of like, oh no, this is the moment where I now need to go, you know, full risk?
Yeah. I left my full-time role actually 3 weeks into thinking about Neighbor Flavor as an idea. So it was pretty like sporadic. That was pretty like, I didn't have a 5-year plan when I left. I was like very much over that job and just wanted out. And I was like, this thing's way more interesting and exciting. I can't stop thinking about it. I'm going to leave. Then I secured the consulting role later, like about a month after being full-time in my startup. I think the thing that was important to me is I did have a mortgage at the time, and I was sharing that with my partner. I didn't want to have a full like burden on someone else around an income as well. I didn't want to like stop going out with my friends and socializing and like being a normal 25 or 26-year-old. And I think that like I think there's maybe it's a little bit over glorified, this idea of like sleeping on couches and eating mee goreng. I think as long as you feel like you can have your headspace in something and put your energy into something, and you probably will be working like maybe most waking hours, and you can find something simple that's going to provide you a minimum income for a period of time. What I think that did for me is it made me not take on the wrong investors. So like I wasn't desperate to like take on the first investor that wanted to put money into Neighbor Flavor, or like wanted to rush to raising a round when we didn't have the right traction to go and raise a round. And I think the ability to have some financial stability yourself means that you're less desperate in your business. So I think like do it, whatever works for you. Some people work really well with their back totally up against the wall, and in a moment of desperation and need, and they pull some magic out of the hat. I think I understood that at the time. I didn't want to like be so black and white about my transition.
Yeah, that's a really like mature understanding of self, basically. Like I agree with you. Like those are different working styles, right? Like I definitely probably fit in that category that you named. Like I like the back against the wall. So it's the only way I can force myself to do anything. But I think that's a very a thoughtful approach. Before we go on to talk about your kind of two companies, can you just describe like what was the feeling when you quit the job and you went to go full time? How would you describe that? Because I think that's a watershed moment, right? For people professionally or for people who are going to build companies, like they suddenly have a realization. What was it for you?
I was really excited, but I was also a little bit lonely. I went from like being in an office environment and sitting in like a team environment to like, this was like before work from home everyone was working from home. I was suddenly like working from home and without a team and without any co-founders, because when you at the very start, you typically don't have co-founders, and I met my co-founders along the way. I didn't have my co-founders before I started Neighbor Flavor or Mr. Yum. I mean, Mr. Yum's co-founders are the same co-founders as Neighbor Flavor, but when I first started, I didn't have a founding team like assembled and ready to go. So the first, I think, few months were pretty, like, it was exciting but pretty lonely. And the and all that you've got to focus on in the early days is like, can you get some traction, can you get some customers, can you build some like pretty scrappy products and hang some things together, and then traction and momentum is what gets other people excited, and it's what gets other co-founders around your idea. And I think a lot of people are looking for co-founders in the early days, but I think if you look too hard, you might not find the right ones. You kind of need to get the bus going, and get the wheels moving, and try and get it rolling before other people will jump on the bus.
So with those first two businesses, like, why did you, like, firstly, why did you lay them to rest? Like, what was you obviously had a realization that you weren't getting momentum and traction, and like, what was the kind of alarm bell moment there?
The first one was pretty simple. It was like a business that you could hire bridesmaids dresses. And I thought it was a good idea, but like, I'd never done anything in fashion. I realized I wasn't very excited about garments and production, and like, I just it wasn't my thing. So I think that was like an easy one we actually sold that to a celebrant, so someone else in the wedding industry, which was a great experience to go through. And then the second business, Neighbor Flavor, was way more complex. We actually had 500 grand in like friends and family money committed to pour into Neighbor Flavor, sorry. But the business was actually like quite illegal, so you can't cook in your home and sell your food without a license to do so. The fines were up to $40,000 for a chef, and at the time Uber and Airbnb were just becoming legal in the country, and there was a lot of lobbying. And I remember this watershed moment where I actually started working with Brad, who was the head of public policy at Uber. So he'd been the guy that was like lobbying the government for all the regulation changes for Uber to become legal. And I was like, hey, can you just like let me know what it would cost to like lobby the government for like a change like this? And he just like wrote this huge like list of like things that like consultants, lawyers, like all this shit that you need. I just looked at it and I went, this is just not what my first startup needs to be like. Like the first company, the first tech business that I tried to do does not need to start with a legal threshold and then like a mountain of cost and lobbying. And we ended up going to the US because it was kind of legal there. They've got like rules around cottage industry. And we joined a company for 3 months, Kerry and I, called Homemade at the time, that was doing the same thing, but like being funded by tech stars, and had $2 million in funding, and learned a lot about unit economics, and that it wasn't going so well. They ended up pivoting twice before shutting down the business, which was a little bit sad. But we learned, essentially it was like illegal in Australia. I went to the US, learned a lot about unit cost economics and how it was very difficult for a food-based peer-to-peer business where the cost of products is very low. And then decided to come home, and we didn't really even lay it to rest. We just stopped working on it, I guess.
And did you, so you fly home, you get over the jet lag, and then did you say, okay, what are we doing next? Like how did that play out?
Yeah, at the time, so Adrian, my co-founder now as well, and actually my partner now, he was building a kind of an incubator called Pitch Black. And it helped, and that was the incubator service that helped us with Neighbor Flavor as well. And he asked if I wanted to, we weren't dating at the time, but he just asked if I wanted to come and work on that with him. So I moved to Brisbane for a couple of years and started building Pitch Black. It wasn't like I didn't want to go back to corporate. I didn't have another idea that I wanted to work on, but I knew I was passionate about learning more in the startup world, and working in a accelerator VC incubator service genuinely gives you like such a breadth of knowledge around the types of companies that exist, the kinds of companies that get traction and succeed, and how you get companies off the ground. So yeah.
Amazing. Okay, so Miss the Yum starts in 2018, and you get going with your original product, and basically COVID, like for so many businesses, brings about a really dramatic shift. But before you got to that point, right, before COVID hit, were you of the conviction that it was working in the original? So perhaps if you can explain to people what pivot you did during COVID. And then what I'm interested to hear though is, did you internally think prior to COVID, oh, this is Mr. Yum is working in the original format, or were you already on the search for a change to the business model?
We started as a visual menu, like literally a menu with photos. And we met a business called the Australian Venue Co. that was the second biggest hospitality group at the time. And they were like, cool, these are cute, like great menus, but can you take orders and can you take payment? And so started building it with them. And we rolled out to 50 of their locations before COVID. Right. COVID came around. We had no intention of building a takeaway product at all. Like we were always focused on in-venue experiences. As well, like the delivery market's 8% of the total food and bev market. So it's 92% happens in the restaurant and 8% at home. And that 8% had billions and billions of dollars of funding, whereas no one's really funded the like in-restaurant experience. And we thought that would be the next kind of evolution of the technology landscape for hospitality. And when COVID came around, we were 12 people. Like we were such a small team, including the founders. And we'd only done a $1.5 million round. We had barely any money in terms of runway. We saw that our revenue went to zero. We were an in-dining experience product, and felt that we needed to do something to help the venues that we were working with and the industry in general. And then we built out our takeaway product and our delivery products off the back of COVID, and that was like a addition, or like a new, an additional part to our product that we never expected to ever do. So COVID's helped us in retrospect, like it's made QR codes known and understood. And now we look back and we're like, yeah, that was a huge catalyst for Mr. Yum. But at the time, it certainly didn't feel like it. It was like, cool, we raised $1.5 million and we've spent half of that, and this might last 6 months, and maybe it will last 12 months, and now we're fucked.
Yeah. So for somebody who earlier in the interview described herself as not operating best with her back up against the wall, I would describe the situation of, hey, I'm running out of money. I've got 6 people who, or 11 other people who depend on me. There's a massive global pandemic and my business model no longer works as back against the wall kind of territory. Was there a moment in a meeting room somewhere where you all looked at each other and somebody was like, hey, like we need it, like we already are positioned to do a takeaway product? How did that come about?
The team actually operate really well back up against the wall, but it doesn't, if it doesn't need to be like that, then it doesn't need to be like that. That exact moment, so I got a call from one of our operators, and he said, in 7 days, hey, he's like, have you seen all the stuff with COVID that's happening in China, etc.? Because it was a bit of a unknown to us at the time. He was like, and in New York, and they were very early to be hit. He said, in 7 days, we're going to be closed. Like all restaurants are going to be closed. Everything will be shut down. And I was like, no way, that's crazy. Like it's unheard of. didn't make any sense at the time. And he said, we've got these menus and like we can take orders and stuff. Can you add like an address field? Can you add some like pickup time slots? Can you help us transition from a restaurant that runs in person to one that runs online? And we built the product in like 9 days. So we like had 7 days before the lockdowns, and we launched it 2 days after the lockdowns. And we only had 2 developers at the time. Andre and Tom built like the whole thing into like a whole new parts of the product in 9 days. So yeah, I think like agility and speed's always been in our DNA. And we look at that moment and remember it often and say like, well, if we were thinking that big and believing that we could do things back then with like 12 people in the team, what can we do now? So yeah, it was definitely a team defining and a business defining moment.
Yeah, that is, and also, you know, so interesting that, you know, fun, like it came out of your customer base, right? You know, like by being close to a customer, they were the ones who kind of helped you towards the idea. What then? Okay, so you get there with you know 2 days late, but it's probably in time. And how did I mean, in that very short space of time, how did your thinking evolve, and how did you then conceive of changing and getting everybody in the business behind the fact that this switch had occurred and the operational implications for the new strategy? Like, what did you do?
I don't think we were that strategic, to be fair. You know, it was very reactive mode. It was surprising. It wasn't something that we had a plan A, plan B, and plan C like mapped out for. I think we felt at the time like the right thing to do was to build what was going to help our merchants, and they were like having to close and they didn't know if they would get government support and stuff. You know, like the first few weeks of COVID were pretty traumatic in terms of having to stand down your whole team, not knowing where your revenue would come from, knowing if you'd have to pay rent relief, like whether you'd get rent relief or not. Like everything was super up in the air. And we were getting calls left, right, and center on whether we could build a takeout product because they didn't want to jump on Uber Eats and pay 20 to 25 to 35% of their sales to an aggregator platform. So yeah, I think we were just like, I don't think there was any discussion internally about whether we thought it was the right thing to do. I think we all felt pretty eager to that was the right thing to do. I think it also probably goes to like it's an example of the kind of team that we had in the early days. And I do think that the people we hired in the early days are different to the people that we hire today. We just hired like a bunch of entrepreneurs, pretty much. Like, I don't think that someone joining you at 3rd, 4th, and 5th employee, like they've got to have a huge risk appetite. They might not have a job in 6 months. They've got to like love the scrappy early beginnings of a company. And likely, I think at least, well, both of those developers had, started things on their own. But I think pretty much everyone else had either come across from pitch black to Mr. Young with us, or had, built a startup previous to joining us. So yeah, in the early days, it's pretty scrappy, right? It's hard for someone straight out of a bank or corporate or something to understand what the hell's going on.
Yes, that is very true. Okay, so throughout my understanding is that you grew 27x that year. Is that right? Like, so through 2020 and into 2021?
Yeah, we grew 27x that year. I think actually probably a more amazing stat is we were doing, particularly GMV before we ended up closing, like all the restaurants closed because of COVID. And in 6 weeks, we were able to make up all of our like dine-in GMV and takeaway. So we built a whole new product, launched it 2 days after, onboarded hundreds of locations into our takeaway product, and built all of that revenue and all of that like transaction volume back up in 6 weeks flat. Our growth, you know, post that is of course important, but I think that kind of momentum in the early transition period was really paramount for us.
And okay, and so as that's occurring, I'm interested to know, you're thinking obviously about growing the business. How does this start affecting your like thinking about your capital pathway? Like how are you gonna fund the growth? Like
oh man, yeah, like I will never forget this actually. It was just such an uncertain time, and so you're like, well, I don't know, what do we do? Like all of our plans that we had, and I also remember listening to podcasts, and you probably remember this too, but there were like so many people coming out and talking about the GFC as like a thing to reflect on. So they were like, the only example that they had was like what happened in the GFC, and everyone was talking about preservation of cash. Like the whole lingo was like, no one expected the VC and the capital markets to become as good and as like buoyant as they were, nor the stock markets and the tech market and the, you know, tech stocks especially. And so everything was like, preserve the cash. We had $700,000 left. We had 12 people in the team. Our revenue went to zero. We forecasted that we'd had like probably like 14 months of runway max, and didn't understand we would get government grants, you know, that sort of stuff at the time. We asked if the team would take a 20% salary sacrifice, meaning like reduce their salaries by 20% and get options instead. And if you went harder than 20%, you would get like an even lower valuation on the options. And everyone did it. And a lot of team members actually went harder than 20%. And we managed to extend our runway probably 2 or 3 months just off the back of some teamwork there. And then, yeah, and actually they're laughing today because the options turn out to be a pretty good investment. Of course they haven't liquidated yet, but yeah, it's looking pretty healthy, a healthy decision for the ones that went hard and the ones that took a little bit more than the 20% as well. The fundamentals started to rebuild. So, you know, 6 weeks, so around May, we started to recover in volume. We showed that we were a really agile team. We showed that we could, you know, twist and turn and move with the times. And the team at 1013, so Stu, he reached out in about July, and I'd known him for 3 or 4 years prior to this. And they led our kind of $2.5 million round in October, which is kind of the first non, you know, family and friend round that we did. Yeah. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was, you know, still the middle of COVID. Everything was unpredictable, and actually largely way before there was like a hockey stick in our growth, like way before restaurants reopened in a big way. So yeah, I think capital I've changed my tune a lot on how I think about capital. I think I used to be very much like a typical Aussie business would and think like only raise what you need, rather than.
I'll do that question in it. Yeah, I see. Yeah, I'll ask you that in a sec. Keep going. Sorry.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I think although you asked about, you know, how did I think about capital at the time? I think when I was first starting Mr. Yum, I think I thought about capital very similar to most Aussie founders, which is like raise what you need, you know, you don't need to raise more than that, protect your dilution, etc., etc. That's like not what American companies think, and that's like not what the most the most successful startups in the world end up doing. Capital has many aspects to it. Of course, one is what you need, but the other is perception. It's hiring, it's talent. You always spend more than what you end up thinking that you're going to spend. And to be fair, it's opportunities. Like we feel like we know for sure that our opportunities post the Series A are dramatically different, and the way we're perceived in market is so different to what we were before.
So was the 10-13 round wasn't the kind was kind of the starting point of you getting to a level of stability and being able to kind of maintain the growth, but as you say, you weren't at the point of the hockey stick. So I'm guessing it was kind of like, oh wow, okay, we just had a killer year, now we've got some money, let's kind of see what happens. How long is it between their round and then this kind of really this next big curve of growth?
We actually did. This is actually important. We pretty much raised every like 6 or 7 months. And that's a trend that's been happening a lot more in startups, like raising more frequently and more regularly. So we did that 2.5 round, and then there was a long time between the 1.5 and 2.5. I think that was 18 months. And then between the 2.5 round and our 11 mil round, so we called both of those rounds post-seed rounds. So we actually did like 2 post-seed rounds. The 11 mil round is when Airtree joined the investment, joined on that investment, and that was March 2021, and we did our Series A at the end of 2021, and that closed in like end of November, December. So there wasn't much time. I think it would have been like 6 months between rounds, sort of thing. Yeah.
I'm gonna ask you. I know I'm gonna finish on this theme, and then I'll ask you these 2 questions. Like, I'm gonna guess, and you've kind of hinted at it a little bit, that like your sophistication as an entrepreneur, like in terms of handling capital and finance, probably evolved almost more swiftly in that period than running the business, right? You're probably pretty comfortable with growing and scaling the business, but like to go in a year from raising a $2 million round to raising an $89 million round suggests a big growth spurt. Like, how did you manage that? How did you educate yourself? How did you, like, who were you leaning on to learn about doing that?
Really good question. We've got some good founder friends. I think it's important to surround yourself with founders that are like 1-2 steps ahead of you. So like, not, more difficult when you've like sold a multi-billion-dollar company way down the track, but if they're a few steps ahead of you, it's I think pretty close to them. Our investors helped a lot, like having a super early stage investor like you guys do for your startups helped us tremendously. Stu and James at Airtree like very clearly laid out that we needed to run a pretty tight process. So all of our other rounds, the Airtree one included, had never been outbound. We didn't do any like outbound pitching. We didn't send our deck broadly at all. Those were like pretty organic inbound rounds that happened, the 2.5 and the 11 mil rounds. The Series A was the first time that Adrian and I had run like a proper investment process, and it was a proper investment process. Like, we had a list, we had a deck, we had a mini deck, we had a bigger deck. We scheduled 45 first intro calls in the space of 2.5 weeks, as in like we were doing like 6 or 7 meetings a day at one point, and splitting up between the 2 of us if we felt like it was too much, but it was like a process and a half. We spoke to investors from like all around the world, all through Europe, all through America, and then narrowed it down to like maybe 10 that we wanted to share data with, open up the data room, made sure we fell in love with them and they fell in love with us whilst looking at the data. We were in LA, San Fran, New York, and London in the 6 weeks that we were raising. So we were like traveling a shitload at the same time. And then when we did get our term sheets, that like from first term sheet to multiple term sheets to signing all happened within like 7 days.
Wow.
So yeah, like it's just I learned a lot from Stu and James, and actually the founders at Linktree are investors in Mr. Yum too. So Alex taught us heaps as well, and we're calling him all the time. But the structure and the process, and I'm not like a structure and process person, so it's particularly I didn't really understand how important that would be, but that was super important to closing our round as well. We like deleted all of our meetings from our calendar. Like literally we told the team, like, you've got this for the next 6 weeks. We're like pretty much MIA, and Adrian and I like just did capital for 6 weeks. So yeah, it's massive. It's absolutely enormous of a project.
Yeah, but also like I mean, very, very well handled to be able to get it into 6 weeks. I mean, that is actually, in the scheme of things, a fast and effective fundraise. So that's awesome. I'm gonna turn to some of these questions, and I'm gonna give you the license here to not answer them, and I will give more general answers to them in case you want to. So one, and I'm going to have to admit, did you offer ESOP or normal options? I'm not quite sure what is intended by normal options, but what percentage of your ESOP is allocated to the team, or what percentage of the company is allocated to the team?
Yeah, yes, we did offer ESOP. Everyone in the team has ESOP, aside from some of our Philippines team members that we can't figure out how to do the taxes for them yet, but we're trying our best. Percentage allocation sits at, I think it's 12-ish% allocated to ESOP at the moment. Each round you do, the investment committee wants to have you top up the unallocated options. So you'll have to, continue carving out options for that pool as you go on as well.
Amazing. Okay. Well, I'd say I'd just add to that, right? So the range for those in the Australian audience, the range in ESOP is between 10 and 15, with hilariously 12.5 being the standard allocation for ESOP. And as Kim says, investors will typically require you to top up at each round. Cedric's asking, if it's not too sensitive, how much equity did you trade for your large Series A, and how did you manage to convince investors to give you a round that large? So you answer whichever parts of that you wish to answer.
Sure, that's fine. Standard is at every round like 15 to 25% dilution, and then at earlier rounds, and then at later rounds like C's and D's and E's, you can definitely get away with like 10% or less dilution because the valuations are so high and the money is sufficient. So yeah, we have pretty much sat between the 15 and 25% at each round that we've done. The 2.5 mil round was a little bit less than that. How did we manage to convince investors? We actually went out to market with a 25 mil. So when you go out to market, like investors, you don't tell them what your valuation is. You just tell them how much money you're raising, and then they do the 20% maths, and they work out what valuation you think you are. So you don't need to say what your valuation is. They'll basically work backwards from the status of the percentage and figure it out themselves. We went out to market saying US 25 mil. We ended up closing a US 65 mil round. The variation between the two is largely driven by investors wanting to compete. So the number one thing you need to do is try and get as many term sheets and as many investors excited at the end. And then they compete on the valuation, they compete on the offer, and they start to convince you to take more money. They don't ever convince you to take less money, they'll start to convince you to take more money. So the objective is try to get as many to the final 10 as possible that are super interested and excited about the business. And they'll just go like, oh, but what about this thing? And what about acquisitions? And what about, it's just like a million ways you can spend more money, and they'll convince you to take more money.
Yeah, that's it. That's interesting. Okay, I'm just going to come across I'm trying to work across all of these, everyone. So Josh asks, many growing startups tend to aspire to be the Uber of X or the Google of Y. Is there a kind of a North Star for Mr. Yum?
We don't have, we use analogies because the media likes analogies. So we say the Spotify, like the Shopify from a B2B angle, so trying to build the best toolkit for hospitality. But we talk about Spotify and its ability to personalize discovery in music a lot. We believe menus should be personalized, and the menu that you look at and I look at will be different. So we talk about Spotify and Shopify, which is very confusing because they sound the same and I always get them confused. But yeah, I guess to use analogies, that's what we say. I think it is helpful to use an analogy. Like we don't talk about that internally that much, but we do in press and media.
So there's a question here about like what to keep in mind when you're choosing a co-founder and the split of equity to keep in mind when you choose them. Do you have any views on that?
I have the most amazing co-founder team. I genuinely could not think of having a better team between the four of us. So after Andre and Kerry and I started, Adrian, Kerry and I started, Andre joined us about 6 months later. And so now there's four of us in the founding team. I think the number one thing is like, you've got to respect them. Like you've got to look at your co-founder genuinely and think that they're way better than you. Like you've got to look up to them. You've got to be like a little bit dumbfounded and excited, and you've got to say to yourself, like, I have no idea how they do X, Y, and Z. If you can't say that about your co-founder, you're going to end up pretty disgruntled. And so like look for that in someone that you look up to, someone that you aspire, and someone you admire. And of course that's in like the work they do, but how they go about their work, how they treat people, how they have conversations, how they have hard conversations and easy conversations. So there's a lot of elements to that about looking for co-founders. And with equity, we didn't start, and I think I can be pretty open and honest about this. We didn't start as like an equal equity split between the four of us, and we're struggling right now to try and find a way to correct that. Like not correct that, but like we're trying to cut Kerry and Andre into actually some of our equity between Adrian and I, because we funded the first 6 months of the business. So there was a larger share attributed to Adrian and I at the start. As you go on 3 years in, it kind of doesn't matter anymore. And if we go in for another 5 years, it really doesn't matter at that point. Like the execution over the 8-year period is more important than the origination of the story. But get your vesting schedule in place. So like vest the founders over 4 years, standard terms, investors like it, it's a big tick. If you want to vest the founders over longer, like go for it, like make it 6 years, make it 5 years, do a longer vesting schedule. If someone doesn't work out and they leave, they leave with a percentage of their stake. So I think in retrospect, I would, if I was doing Miss Yum again, I would have started with a more equal footing and then just have a very long vesting schedule so that if it doesn't work out, that we can solve for that without much pain.
Obviously, we look at a lot of businesses being formed, a lot of co-founders meeting each other, and I think I would add a couple of points to that, like or summarize what you said, which is one, that you need alignment on values, and that was what Kim was talking about when she said like the way that you talk to people, the way that you work, how you communicate. There needs to be really strong alignment there. But then there needs to be divergence on skills, right? You need to have complementary skill sets. And that's what she described in terms of like, looking in awe at your team, at your co-founder doing something that you really can't do, and vice versa. But I think the other observation that I made listening to you both talk about equity and your co-founders is what Kim clearly has, and it makes her a great leader, is she's obviously has humility and generosity. And I think that if you can bring those to a co-founding relationship, like that's the critical part, because in business, unfortunately, it always gets tense at some point, and working out how you're going to handle that. If you're starting from a point of humility and generosity, you've got a better chance of weathering the storms. Wow, I'm kind of bombarded by questions. Unfortunately, I am acknowledging that I am stopping this promptly on time because no doubt Kim has a 1 o'clock and I'm sure many of you do. So I'm not going to get to everything, but I will do my best, everybody. One question here comes like, what traction did you have in terms of, you know, percentage or metrics, etc., before you knew that you needed to raise money?
I always knew that we needed to raise money. There's very, very, very few successful startups in the world that like bootstrap their way to success. And I know Atlassian is one, but Atlassian started in a time when people weren't raising as much money. In today's landscape, it's very difficult to win unless you do go out and raise. So I think we always knew that we needed to. Thinking about when, I guess, is, you know, pretty critical and pretty important. And actually, Adrian has taught me that it's never going to feel like the right time. The story is never perfect. Your numbers are always a bit not perfect. We didn't go into this Series A having perfect charts and perfect hockey sticks and everything like that. Like, it was scrappy in new regions. Australian businesses going really well, but our UK and US markets are so infinitely, like, so in its infancy. It's so new. It's very scrappy and a bit shit when we were raising money. So yeah, I think, like, don't wait for things to be perfect because they just won't be. And if an investor's looking for perfect, then, like, you know, go and buy a pre-IPO share as opposed to buying a seed stage or a Series A share, right? Like, you won't get perfect at that point. I think the thing that we did do well in our Series A is if we came out of a meeting and Adrian and I look at each other, we're like, yeah, we kind of fucked that up. Like, we did not answer that well. We'd like actually like delay a whole bunch of our next meeting. So we did really good like traffic lighting. So we'd be like, okay, cool, that's a question that we need to think about, and we didn't answer that well. Let's push back. Like, VCs are actually quite free. They're not, their meetings aren't like, their calendars aren't like super packed often. So you just say, hey, can we delay this 48 hours? We want to like rethink the way that we talk about X. And they go, okay, cool. Like, why not? You know, it doesn't matter. Even if the meeting is like this afternoon, let's like reschedule it for 48 hours. And so we did do that a bunch, and it really helped us because we didn't want to roll into the next meeting like answering that question shit again. So just like I guess that's like the iterative process of building product, of learning to pitch, of learning to answer risk-based questions, etc. Like, take stock, cool, like, let's not do that again.
That's great, Kim. Can you give me names to some of those firms where the VC partners are really free so that I can apply for a job there? That would be that's excellent.
I mean, they're not free, but they seem to be able to carve out like 45 minutes in 48 hours pretty easily.
Okay. I think that probably takes us to the end of our conversation here today. And I really want to thank you for coming, for spending time with all of us, but also speaking so candidly. You know, I know I speak, I think, on behalf of like a lot of people who are in the process of trying to build businesses, that it's so hard to get information like this and to really understand the journey and to have it, personalized and humanized. And so thanks for coming in and speaking so openly to all of us about your experience. We're really excited to watch what happens over the coming months and years. And we hope you have as much fun in 2022 as you did in 2021. So all the best. Good luck, and we'll speak to you soon.